and stinting work, which has allowed us to be here today. I wish to address the room as the head of the Uruguayan delegation. We are currently holding the pro-tempore presidency of the South American Conference on Migration. This conference brings together Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, Chile, Guyana, Peru, Paraguay, Suriname and Venezuela, among other countries. Dear colleagues, the position of the South American Conference has been set out in black and white in the Lima Declaration on the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. This was adopted in Lima on the 28th of September 2017, and our position is contained therein. We believe that this declaration is balanced, which places migrants at its core. We see them as subjects of rights, and as the text states, human rights of migrants are the very basis on which our migration policy and program should be built. It is for that reason that we believe that the GCM is a global framework of human rights which encompasses all migrant persons. Moreover, we believe that migrants should be included in all public policy on migration, and their social inclusion should be fostered, including through their access to healthcare, education, housing, justice, etc. We believe they should enjoy the same rights as nationals of their country of destination. We believe that migrant women should be empowered. That's a crucial component of migratory governance, and that is why we would propose the inclusion in the GCM of a framework for assistance which focuses on women and their family members. Moreover, we are proposing that the compact incorporate a framework for assistance to migrant children and adolescents. Distinguished colleagues, given that irregular migration is not a crime, South American countries have always championed opening regular pathways for admission, and we have championed regularization programs and have acceded to instruments as part of Mercosur, among other bodies. We believe that the GCM should enshrine the commitment to promote regular migration. By way of conclusion, we point to the importance of ensuring that the IOM continue to support us and continue to play a key role in affording assistance and support to countries as they seek to implement and implement commitments and honor commitments enshrined in the GCM. The Lima Declaration champions the right to migrate or not emigrate in line with the rich historic legacy of nations in the South American region. We believe that this declaration, the Lima Declaration, should feed into debates which will ultimately lead to the GCM. This GCM is crucial if we are to ensure a dignified existence for thousands and thousands of people who leave their home every year, and to do this requires the cooperation of all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Zambia is next.
Thank you, co-facilitator. Speaking on behalf of the delegation of the Republic of Zambia, I wish to take this opportunity to thank the Mexican government for hosting us and commend the co-facilitators and the Office of the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General for International Migration for organizing this preparatory stock-taking meeting towards a global compact for safe, order and regular migration. Chair, we wish to assure you of our support and cooperation during this meeting. I also wish to thank the panelists, both the ones in the morning and the afternoon one, for having taken a thorough discussions in terms of highlighting the recommendations in a more concise manner, and have noted the tremendous work which has been done since the informal sessions were launched. What we can say, Chair, is that the sessions have indeed raised awareness and endowed us with an in-depth understanding between perception and reality on issues of migration. My delegation is therefore happy with the manner in which the process has been unfolding, and we are looking forward to a more concrete outcome of the stock-taking conference to mark the beginning of phase 2. of the process before the Global Compact for safe order and regular migration is adopted. Human mobility, Chair, has become more complex, and as long as the human race exists, this will continue and will even be more dynamic. The increase in migration world over, and in particular Africa, has been as a result of many factors. But we believe that some of these factors are things that could be avoided and could be dealt with. Issues like conflict, poverty, political instability, as well as a lack of social economic opportunities in countries of origin. These can easily be attended to if only we continue becoming more politically resolved to deal with the issues that are affecting our countries. And it's our view that unless these things are done, the problem of migration and the using of irregular pathways will continue. We are looking forward to having a global compact that will promote the mobility of the human race in a more dignified manner, and we want to ensure that to see to it that the key elements that we are looking at are able to operationalize the political commitments in the New York Declaration. Chair, despite the efforts of ensuring dignified migration, lack of protective mechanisms or legal migration options, including for asylum seekers, has resulted in migrants using increasingly dangerous routes and techniques in order to reach to their destination countries. This has made them vulnerable to smugglers and the traffickers. Having seen the loss of many lives during south-north migration, as migrants cross vast bodies of waters and deserts, using unsafe modes of transportation, as Zambia, we believe that South-South cooperation is of particular importance to orient and influence the work undertaken by international organizations. This could even be reinforced further if the push factors are addressed within the Global South, for which Zambia is very committed. We therefore look at this stock-taking conference, Chair, as part of, not only to be a part of giving a meaning to the UN General Assembly Resolution 71/1, but also to offer an opportunity to the international community to be more responsible to their own political commitment as rooted in the New York Declaration.
Thank you very much. I have to ask you to come to an end, because
Yeah,
we have
Chair,
many delegations asking for the floor and
Chair.
only a little time left.
Yes, I'm concluding. It is in this regard, Chair, that while noting that the Global Compact seeks to address all aspects of international migration, my delegation wishes to echo and support the call for the need of a follow-up mechanism looking into the performance of Global Compact, as that will afford an opportunity of self-evaluation of the international community in general and states in particular. We thank the IOM for the role it has played, even by helping African countries to come up with some kind of common language towards this Global Compact.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes left, because I also want to give at least very briefly the opportunity to the members of the panel. I still have Eritrea, Chile, Bolivia, Liechtenstein, and China on my list. I have many more, but I'm afraid I will have to close the list then. Eritrea is next.
Thank you, co-facilitator. I would like to thank the panelists for their remarks and useful insight. I would like also to thank the co-facilitators for the transparent, if I may say, the innovative ways you have been conducting the process. Two quick questions. One of the takeaways from this morning's discussion is the public discourse on migration is plagued with inaccuracies and misunderstandings and exaggerations. In many cases, the negative narratives about migration is related to a public perception, mythical or real, that migrants are taking local jobs. How can the private sector, the employers in this case, who are the owners of the job, those jobs, help in changing this negative public perception of migration and combat xenophobia? The second question, for many developing countries, their diaspora community is an important resource. Harnessing this potential through the transfer of skills and investment and remittance has been a challenge. How can the private sector, again, in partnership with governments, could help increase the migrant contribution to their countries of origin in forms of skill transfer, but more importantly, in lowering the cost of remittances to the agreed SDGs 3% or below. We look forward for a fruitful and productive outcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have Chile next.
Permítame.
Thank you very much. Allow me to thank the Government of Mexico and the authorities of Jalisco for allowing us to have this meeting. We believe that this meeting is an important milestone in terms of a transition between the first consultation phase and the second phase, which involves design and negotiation on the pact. We refer to what Uruguay said regarding the South American Migration Conference's position on the Global Compact on migration, and we endorse those conclusions. Panelists this morning and this afternoon, and particularly the representatives of the National Human Rights Institution, made a number of important points, and I, in line with what they said, would suggest that we need to reflect upon what we wish to see from this process as we stand at the beginning of the 3 days, so that at the end of the 3 days we can look back at what we did. For Chile, it's clear that a GCM will require institutional architecture and a monitoring and follow-up process, both of which are effective and efficient. Against this backdrop, United Nations is in the midst of a reform process, and in that context it's important to harness existing capacities so that we can achieve success in a tangible fashion. And it's important to harness all of the input of all panelists in this connection. Now, this institutional architecture to which I referred needs to harness a number of capacities. There needs to be the harnessing of data, capacity building needs to be increased for civil societies and state agents, there needs to be technical expertise needs to be harnessed when it comes to all those working on migration needs to ensure that their voices can be heard. Now, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Indeed, it will be impossible to do so. Now, all of this is a major challenge, but it does need to be done. What do we need to do now? We need to continue the dialogues that we began in Geneva and at the headquarters of the IOM, and indeed with a number of migration organizations. The conversation that we've begun here needs to be furthered here and now. Chile's position is clear. IOM is crucial to ensure that we have a properly managed, successful GCM. That should be the goal, and its goal as the leader line agency. And to ensure success, there needs to be capacity building, monitoring, follow-up, and impact analysis on migration. There needs to be a human rights focus. Protection needs to be championed. I would call upon all of us here present to raise the questions that we have so that it can be answered. Ultimately, we need to have appropriate institutional architecture so that this compact can be strengthened. I would endorse what was said by the Minister of El Salvador and would ask the panelists what they think and what the co-facilitators think about which is the most appropriate mechanism to ensure coordination and follow-up for a GCM, which needs to be close to migrant people and really in tune with their needs. Thank you.
Co-facilitators always think what member states think, so we're very much looking forward to the exchanges today, tomorrow, and Wednesday on this particular issue. I have Bolivia next, the Vice Minister of Institutional and Consular Affairs, Her Excellency Maria del Carmen Almendras Camargo. Madam Vice Minister, you have the floor. Microphone for Bolivia, please. Here.
Gracias.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Panelists, co-facilitator, I represent a state in which we prioritize the participation of civil society, not only through bodies, institutional bodies which are established through our legislation, but we also champion the participation of civil society when public policies are made, for example. In this connection, our president and the government of Bolivia continues to prioritize people-centered diplomacy. This year in June in my country there was a global conference held entitled For a World Without Walls Towards Universal Citizenship. In this conference we saw the attendance of thousands of delegates from 45 countries. That conference ended with a valuable outcome document which brings together major conclusions which are in line with many of the conclusions reached today by panel members. We rejected in this outcome document the criminalization of any form of migration and the construction of any type of wall which separates peoples. Our conference also analyzed the root causes which give rise to migration. Some of these have been cited in the New York Declaration. The New York Declaration underscores the role of war, climate change, and in migration, as well as a prevailing model which fosters asymmetries and inequalities between people. Bolivia believes that there can be no global compact which is robust, which does not look to foster a commitment to tackle the root causes behind the major migratory crisis which we're currently witnessing. The Global Compact has to take that into account in order to be successful. Now, we believe that the core of the GCM has to call for us to overcome this kind of the approach that we're currently following. We can't simply talk about looking for safe, orderly and regular migration. Rather, we need to focus on what Pope Francis said this morning. We need to, instead of this somewhat reductive approach, we need to have a human rights-based approach which looks to welcome, protect and integrate migrants and their families into countries of destination. To conclude, allow me to recall what my president said. President Evo Morales has said, he's said this publicly. That is our concern at the United States announcement that they were withdrawing from this crucial negotiation process, which will lead towards the GCM. They've withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, UNESCO, and in addition to that, they're now withdrawing from the GCM. Ladies and gentlemen, not only is this an attempt to breach and undermine the basic principles of the United Nations within the multilateral system, rather it is an affront on principles which, if to be upheld, require the support of all countries and peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Vice Minister. Liechtenstein is next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator, and let me begin by thanking the government of Mexico for the great hospitality that we are all enjoying here at this conference. Thank you also to the panel and the panelists of this morning, also and this afternoon, for very interesting contributions. We feel that they bring us already a step closer to the aim of this conference, which in our view is to provide you, the facilitators, with a sound basis to present us with an ambitious first proposal for the GCM. Liechtenstein will of course be fully engaged in that process, and we will do so based on our national experience with migration, which is a positive one. 1/3 of the Liechtenstein population is made up of migrants, and they have very significantly contributed to the economic development and the social development of Liechtenstein, and at the same time, given the dimensions of our country, a large part of the Liechtenstein population is also migrating to other countries to benefit from educational and work opportunities. So in Liechtenstein you will have a strong supporter of an outcome that is firmly angled on a positive narrative and view of migration, and that was something that was very importantly made this morning in the panel, but also this afternoon. I know we have very little time, but I would just like to mention 3 areas where we see particular potential for the GCM to make a substantive contribution. The first one is on the human dimension. where we have very important standards in human rights and international law, but also in other commitments such as the SDGs. But we see a very significant implementation gap, and that is particularly wide in our view in the area of gender equality and the empowerment of women. So we'd like to see a strong gender perspective in the GCM. And the other area is the protection of migrants, in particular from trafficking and enslavement, and the protection of minors, and in particular those that are not accompanied by adults. So we would like to see in these areas very firm and concrete commitments to close the implementation gap. Second, the area of labor integration, we believe, is a very important driver for economic and social development if it is done properly, and Liechtenstein has, I believe, particular experience to share in that area, and we're happy to do so in the upcoming days, including through the dual system of vocational training that we have, that also Switzerland has, of course. Third and lastly, let me briefly mention the global dimension, since it's been prominently mentioned by the panel as well. We see the need for stronger governance at the level of UN institutions and also at the intergovernmental level, and we will work for strong modalities to ensure the commitments we make are implemented. And maybe I would like to ask here also the view of the panelists, how they would see that such modalities would have to look like. In particular, Mr. González Pérez has mentioned an independent mechanism maybe for the monitoring of implementation of the commitments, and we're interested in hearing more detail about that. And I believe with that the GCM can make a very significant contribution to the achievement of the SDGs, and we're looking forward to engaging in the coming days.
Thank you. Thank you, Liechtenstein. China is next on my list, please.
Thank you, co-facilitator. First of all, allow me to thank the government of Mexico and the United Nations for the hospitality given to the conference. I'd like to thank the panelists for the important statements and interventions. The GCM's formulation is aimed at improving the global governance for migration. It is very significant. China will continue to support this process and will be participating in this process. I would like to stress the following points. First, we need to comprehensively and objectively look at the immigration issue. We are, after all, a community of shared future. We must acknowledge migrants' contribution to the harmonious society. They play a positive role in this aspect. At the same time, we must also recognize some of the challenges they bring, for instance, irregular migration, being smuggled and being trafficked, for instance. My second point in this aspect is that we support the countries to safeguard and protect their human rights in accordance with their legislation, domestic legislation and the law. We need to guarantee that they have access to employment, medical care, so on and so forth. At the same time, their treatment should not be above the national conditions of the countries concerned. It is unrealistic and to have a cross-the-board target in this regard. The imbalanced development is one of the factors driving migration. We need to implement the 2030 agenda adopted by the United Nations. We need to have common development. We need to promote regular and safe migration. My fourth point is that war and natural disaster, against these circumstances, there is migration as well. We need to address disputes through peaceful means. We should not interfere in each other's internal affairs. We need to increase the capacity of the other countries to deal with natural disasters. Of course, we need to, upon request, give assistance to those countries to deal with these issues. Co-facilitator, we believe the GCM must be in observance of some principles such as the member state-driven and the sovereignty principle, and the UN playing the major role in this aspect. We hope that all sides can work towards the same goal and in order to reach consensus as broad as possible. Thank you, Mr. Co-facilitator.
I have one more speaker who has been waiting very patiently since this morning. Costa Rica, please, you have the floor. Can we get a microphone for Costa Rica, please? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Many thanks, Ambassador Lauber. It is a pleasure to see you co-facilitating this process along with my good friends, Ambassador Gomez Camacho. I will briefly thank you for the opportunity given to me. I wish to congratulate you for the format that you've chosen for these meetings. My delegation throughout this process has transparently facilitated our work and made clear what our country's position is regarding this global compact. We will submit our formal statement to the Secretariat so it can be fed into the outcome document and so that our national position is once again clear. But I do wish to raise a number of concise observations. I wish to thank panelists that spoke this morning and this afternoon. I particularly thank this afternoon's panelists for pointing to the fundamental role that civil society plays in this process. This process, as has been said by many, is a process which must be perceived to be one whole process, rather than a piecemeal one, and a process which brings on board civil society members, because that's crucial if we are to achieve success. There can be no doubt that this is a multilateral process in which we have to harness the very best of multilateralism. And if we are to do that, we cannot cast aside these sustainable development goals. They need to prevail as we work on this global compact for migration. Now, 3 very brief points. First, in response to the question raised by Ambassador Gomez Camacho this morning, that is, what have we learnt about knowing migration better? Where does demystification fit into all of this? He said that's important, and that's true. In that connection, we have to look at the impact that migration has on development, both for countries of destination, countries of origin, for everyone. As he said, it's a win-win endeavour, and that's true, and we need to drive that message home. Migration is not only north-south, as we've always believed it to be. Migration is largely south-south migration today. The impact that middle-income countries have on the world in terms of migration should make us rethink everything we think about international cooperation. Middle-income countries are the countries that are welcoming most migrants to their shores, and that is very important to bear in mind. When it comes to safe, orderly, regular migration, that should be the rule and not the exception. And these have always been the cornerstones of our national position. My second point, the role of economically empowering women. That has to be a cross-cutting issue, one which feeds into all the work we conduct on this global compact. Women have to be drivers, agents of their own situation and drivers of change. They are seen as vulnerable, and that's often true, but the paradigm has to change. We have to stop seeing them as vulnerable individuals and see them as drivers of transformation and change when they migrate. And that's something that my delegation is actually delighted to see emerge from many of these discussions. And last but not least, I would say that, as I said previously and as was said this morning, this is a multilateral process. In recent days, things have hit the headlines which suggest that the global nature of this compact is being threatened. But this compact should nevertheless be seen, and particularly in line of these recent headlines, as an opportunity, not a threat, not a difficulty. This compact will allow us to strengthen our leadership on migration. All regions can do that. Of course, it's often said that you might find solutions in one region that can't be rolled out on another, because obviously regions differ, but we need to work together. Thank you.
All the delegations who didn't get a chance to speak so far today, we have one more opportunity in the context of the TED Talks. You have multiple opportunities tomorrow in the action groups, which are smaller, and of course still on Wednesday. I have an announcement to make that will explain to you why I have to insist a bit on time. The announcement is the following. The governor of Jalisco State is organizing an event this evening to welcome all delegations and participants to Puerto Vallarta. The event will be held outside of this venue on the right side when exiting the building. It starts at 6:30. And I really worry, once the mariachi singers start outside and you hear them in here, people will immediately evacuate the room. So we need to keep more or less in time. But I still want to give a short opportunity, and I really have to ask you to be super brief to the colleagues and members of the panel. There were a number of questions addressed to you, some concerning the follow-up and review, the implementation. There was a question with regard to the role of NHRIs, and there was a question about how can we change the perception. Please, very, very briefly, I'll start on my far right. Judy, you want to take up one of the issues briefly, please?
Okay, I'll be very brief. I wish I was on your far left rather than your far right, but anyway, you know, as a good trade unionist. I mean, it was very encouraging to hear from the government in terms of how they see some of the fundamental issues going forward, including the emphasis, I have to say, on the role of women's empowerment, women's economic empowerment. As a trade unionist, I would have to say social dialogue has to be at the heart of anything in this global compact process. So that dialogue between government, employers, and workers' organizations, if we're going to have a compact that's actually based on fundamental human rights and addresses the development issues that we've heard about, both from an origin and destination country perspective.
Thank you very much. Ignacio.
Yes, it was a pleasure to hear a lot of convergence with some governments. Costa Rica, the 4 points, I mean, those are the things also that we're pushing as and work on as civil society. With Bolivia talking about human mobility and migration, human mobility in the center too. Liechtenstein, well, we as civil society, we're also organizations, we're also working on for the reporting and monitoring on this option, of course, of bringing the SDG or the monitoring to the level of the high-level political forum on sustainable development as much as possible, not reinventing new mechanisms. And then certainly there is a challenge for civil society to continue feeding you also with elements of evidence and so on. And you do have about 60 civil society delegates there, and I think it's really the opportunity also with the mariacas outside at 6:30 to be discussing with us. Thank you.
Absolutely. There's always the corridor talk, of course. Mamadou, s'il vous plaît.
Merci.
Thank you. We talked a lot about globalization in El Salvador in particular, and we share this view. The issue of follow-up and monitoring was raised. We did come up with proposals last week. We said that there's certain principles that need to be abided, and this would to be included in the provisions. That it has to be inclusive, and the three fundamental elements of monitoring, clear, well known to everyone, in particular women and children who know how to use the mechanism, needs to be put in place. So regionally speaking, we did talk about this, and integration institutions that we have, and they need to be put forward within the framework of regional integration. Thank you.
The perception, the image?
Certainly. Very quickly on that. I will admit that the business community can do more in promoting the positive view towards migration. But I do think much has been done, much has been accomplished over the last number of years. I personally, from an anecdotal basis, believe that we're doing far more in demonstrating the role of migrants in entrepreneurship, the number of companies which have been established, some very, very successful, globally largest brand names have been established by migrants, and these stories are getting out more and more. One also can't forget that one of the best ways of improving and enhancing the image of migrants is by enhancing the migrant experience, and that comes through many ways, one of which is integration. And I would argue that employment is one of the primary factors of integration, which in the long run will help the migrant experience and help to build the image. Before I give up the microphone, though, I would like to respond to the distinguished intervener from El Salvador, speaking about the importance of a follow-up mechanism once the GCM is hopefully completed by the end of next year. And I must say that we in the business community agree entirely that this is a process that needs to continue. And if it's going to be successful, we have to build some type of mechanism, be it peer review, be it reporting, be it continuing consultations. I will leave it up to you to decide what that should be, but we would highly endorse the incorporation of the GCM of some follow-up mechanism.
Thank you much. It will be completed in July of next year and then ceremoniously adopted by the end of the year. It's an important little correction I have to make at this point.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Senator, please.
I would begin with the question raised by our facilitator, the challenges facing this global compact. We have to have our values clear, two values in particular. The need to protect people and the focus on human rights. We can't simply talk about security or remittances. What we're really talking about are human rights, economic and security issues. If we talk about those, we're talking about policies. But this compact needs to have people at its core. That's a value we need to have clear. Nepal, migration and development. We're not simply talking about development. We're talking about market factors, demography, technological change. That will shape the way we work and shape migration accordingly. Now, another point was raised about implementation. Implementation is closely related to the design of the instrument itself. This compact needs to be brought more closely in line with Agenda 2030 than the Paris Agreement on climate change, or also in line with the Paris Agreement on climate change. The approach we adopt needs to bring on board civil society and take account of all their views. Of course, it was said that this is a non-binding compact, so we need to understand the what's, the hows and the whens. What will the goals be? By when do they have to be achieved? And how are we going to measure this achievement? I'd like to take this opportunity to sort of fly the flag of the IPU here. We have different agendas as parliamentarians, but we've come together and developed parliamentarian manuals for the implementation of a number of our agendas. As an organisation, I think it would be important for this compact to have manuals to facilitate its implementation so that stakeholders everywhere, parliamentarians, NGOs, members of the productive sector, are able to implement the pact and better follow it up and monitor, rather than that all being left to chance and in ambiguous terms.
Something on the role of the NHRIs?
Thank you very much. First of all, I am delighted and deeply satisfied to note that as far as the 6 thematic areas of focus proposed by Henry, GANRI, when I raised those, there was a lot of consensus regarding their importance. I'd like to reiterate the importance of focusing on decent, dignified, non-discriminatory treatment of migrants. That needs to be the guiding principle of our work. I think Madame Cuevas said that very eloquently. We are here, above all else, talking about human rights, and that needs to be remembered. A number of comments made in this House this afternoon pertain to how we can measure the implementation of the compact. And GANRI has been looking at this issue, and in that connection we've looked at this independent mechanism and what shape that might take so that we can measure the scope and impact of this global compact. In GANRI we've noted that there are several instruments and several bodies that are dealing with migration and migrants. You've got the ILO, there's the UNHCR, the IOM, and there's the HLPF, the High-Level Dialogue on International Migration. How can all of these bodies and their respective endeavours be brought together? And how can we ensure that there's a certain degree of consistency across all the reports that states are required to submit in line with Agenda 2030 commitments? How can these reports be harmonised with feedback given on the implementation of the GCM? And how can we foster access to all of this information so that we can take stock of progress made with the implementation of the GCM? If the GCM does not become a mechanism which monitors states in terms of progress made, well, it's quite useless, if you like, and the GCM cannot function separately from the treaty bodies and commitments made by the GANRI. It can't function separately from the UPR. We all need to work together. The major challenge for the GCM is to establish this kind of mechanism which runs across the board and brings everyone together. This monitoring mechanism needs to be established but cannot neglect the input of other instruments. I think Indonesia raised a question. That would be our advice in terms of ensuring states sign conventions that they haven't yet signed when it comes to the rights of migrant workers. What can we do to promote their accession to these conventions? Well, that's what we're doing at national human rights institutional level. We're calling upon governments to sign these agreements, and parliamentarians have a key role to play here. We have a clear role to play in ensuring they accede to and ratify these conventions. The first proposal Ganri made was that of ensuring consistency. What I meant by that is that all other international instruments need to be taken into account. Pressing, unequivocal appeals need to be made to member states to sign and ratify conventions in the field of migration. Conventions related to children, the childhood, women, but all conventions related to migration, and the ultimate aim is to detect and analyze vulnerabilities. Thank you.
Much to all the members of the panel. Before we release this panel, I want to introduce the next chairperson, the master of ceremony of the following segment, that is going to be the Idea Lab session. We don't have a break. We're going to go right into the next segment, and the segment will be chaired by Ms. Marta Foresti, who is a managing director at the Overseas Development Institute and leads the Institute's work on migration, governance, climate and natural resources. Marta Foresti established ODI's initiative on migration and development, and she leads all policy and media engagement, public affairs and advisory work, and high-level convening, as well as supervising research. As part of this, Ms. Foresti recently acted as a thematic expert at the 4th informal thematic session of the UN Global Compact for Migration. She also led the influential work on migration and the 2030 Agenda Sustainable Development launched at UNGA 2017. Before I ask her to come up here and take over, please allow me or help me in thanking the panelists for an excellent discussion this afternoon. Marta, please, it's your floor.
Hay otros instrumentos.
I'm gonna have to leave my water. And also I need to leave the phone because
remember there's a table. You're going to have 3 tables.
I'm going to put them in there because Tina sent me the details of the announcement I need to make at the end of the day. It's just 6:20, not before. It's nearly 5 o'clock. We're nearly half an hour late. Yeah. 6:20 roughly. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's better. Thank you. So I'm going to go up, say a few things, and then I'll call you, and then I'll introduce you, and then call you to the stage, okay?
Introduce me, and then when you're finished introducing, I'm going to come.
I'll come down, and you come up. Okay. Or maybe I should come up, I'll welcome you to the stage, so it's nice, and then I'll hand over to you. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Lauber, Ambassador Camacho, and Special Representative Louise Auber for inviting me to chair this session with you today. I'm very aware that it's the end of the day, that you're all tired, but as you all know, there is a feast expecting all of us at the end of this session, so I invite you all to stay so that you can also soon enough enjoy tequila, and I can promise you that what you're about to witness in the next half hour will put you in the mood for the party that will follow. Thank you, Ambassador Lauber, for introducing me. I don't need to tell you that, unfortunately, today I have a very low voice, but I hope that it will last for an hour and a half, and that you're all able to hear what I'm about to say. So, this is, I like to think, very much a first. We are having an Ideas Lab and 3 TED Talk at a UN meeting. And everybody's very excited about it. And I am very grateful for the organizer of the preparatory meeting for having the vision and the will to try something as new as this in this setting. And we very much hope that you will enjoy it, that we will participate, and we will create a precedent for all UN meetings and summit to come. So we all know that migration is a politically challenging issue. I don't need to tell you that. I think we heard this morning that the process of the Global Compact so far has actually unveiled and helped us all understand much better, not just the nature of the challenges, but also the opportunities that are beginning to emerge and that the Global Compact will no doubt further develop in the next few months. But let me put to you as a theme that I would like you to stay with me for the rest of this session, that without, if we are to make progress, as well as challenges and opportunities, we need ideas and human experiences. Because without ideas and people and the experiences of people, there is no negotiation, there will be no deal, there will be no commitments, in short, there will be no compact. So we're going to spend now this session talking about the ideas and the human experiences behind them. And I hope that in the discussions that you will all be able to join in a minute, you will take the opportunity to really engage with what you're about to hear from our speakers on their ideas and their experiences. Now, let me put to you also that ideas and experiences are not just about data and evidence. They're important. We're going to hear about it in a couple of minutes. But what makes an idea different is that ideas are also about reasoning, inspirations, actions by human beings. They're shaped by human experiences, and that's what we're here to hear about. And let me tell you that you're in for a treat. I've spent a few hours with the 3 speakers that we're going to have on stage in a minute, and they have very inspiring and interesting stories to tell. Now, why a session on ideas and experiences in the middle of a UN political process, or rather at the beginning, or on a forthcoming political process? Because we've heard a lot, and I've certainly heard, during the thematic sessions and today, reference to the need for a new or a better narrative around migration if this compact is to change the hearts and minds of people around the world. But the questions remain about who's going to work on this new narrative, where should this new narrative begin to evolve, and how are we going to go about making that a reality and making sure that that's woven in the textile of the compact. Well, that's what we're beginning to do today. So we want to use this session to put the basis for this narrative with all of you. So we have 3 themes that we're going to hear about: data and evidence, public perceptions and narrative, and migration and identity. And we're lucky enough to have 3 absolutely outstanding speakers to inspire us all with their ideas and their experiences. Now, they were chosen because their achievements and their contributions in all walks of life, they very much work and live outside of the UN circles, away from political negotiations. They're pioneer analysts, business women and men, journalists and activists who have made incredible contribution to the world and the thinking around migration with their thinking and their actions. So, as it happens, all 3 of them, and 4 if you include me, are migrants of sorts, are human beings on the move, very much so, some of them by helicopters, as we're about to hear in a minute, and they do come from different corners of Earth. Each of them will deliver a TED Talk style talk with all of you for about 15 minutes, and then after each of their talk, we're going to have about 10 minutes for a question and answer sessions, first with me, and then I'll bring 2 or 3 of you to join the conversation with me and the speaker. Now, let me say, this is your opportunity not to make a statement. This is the opportunity to engage with what you're going to hear. It's the opportunity to be moved, to be angry, to agree, to disagree, to say things that normally are not, are not allowed or not common practice in this kind of meetings. Please take this opportunity. Please do not make a statement. I will have to be strict and stop you if you do so. And also, as I said, remember there is tequila at the end of the road, so you will need to know, the briefer you are, the shorter that road will feel for all of you. So let me introduce the first speaker. Solveig, please join me on the stage. So Solveig Hieronymus, I hope I pronounce your very interesting name and surname correctly. Solveig is a partner at McKinsey & Company. She's based in Germany, in Munich, I understand. And your work at McKinsey mainly focuses on working and servicing clients in the public sector, so governments, multilateral institutions, foundations, on a variety of topics: education, employment, public health, sustainability, and resource and productivity. So we have something in common there. We work on lots of different themes, but you also lead McKinsey's work on migration and refugees. And that's one of the key interesting things about the speakers today, is that all of them work on all sorts of issues that relate to migration, but are not confined to migration only. You engage with a number of actors in Europe and around the world. You've had a life before McKinsey at the UN, and then at Goldman Sachs and at JP Morgan. We're very lucky to have you here with us today. Over to you for the first ever, I hope, TED Talk at the UN meeting or summit in history. Wow. No pressure.
Stakes are high, stakes are high. Can you hear me okay with this microphone? Is that okay? Yeah, maybe. Shall I get a microphone from you? Can I?
That might mix this up.
Yeah, I'll try with this. I think that's better. When I can't hear myself, it's a good indicator you can't hear me either. So I'm trying with this. So thank you for having me on a late afternoon. I just learned myself there's only those talks between you and a big fiesta outside, so I tried to be interesting. I promise I won't make a statement. I didn't prepare one. I just have a couple of ideas. And I wanted to field those with you in the course of the next 10 or 15 minutes or so. So migration, as you're all here well aware, and you've heard in all the discussions already throughout today, is a highly emotional topic. Highly political topic. So it drives elections. We've seen in Brexit, we've seen in the US, part of the German elections, very important topic, migration always in there. It drives emotions. So there's people on the street who are afraid of the other, the new neighbor they might be getting. We're seeing at the same time incredibly emotional pictures, in particular of refugees in the past 2 or 3 years. That's also driving up emotions on a public scale. And in this field between emotions and politics and just complexity, people get interested in our work, so McKinsey's work on migration, because it's data-driven, it's fact-based. And that's also what I wanted to bring to you in the session today. So much needed facts and data as the basis, if you will, for a constructive dialogue and how to better manage migration. And I don't get tired of saying this, but in a world where actually alternative facts are even a thing today, it's even a standing term, it's even more important actually to focus on the real facts around migration out there, and also the facts you need in order to manage better, because successful migration and integration will not happen by chance. So with that, let me begin. We fielded a large research with our McKinsey Global Institute last year. We launched it at the end of last year. I have a couple of copies still outside. If not, just drop me a note. I think my contact should be somewhere on the papers, and I'll be readily available to share this with you. And basically what we did is, for the first time, we integrated all the data sets that were actually out there on global migration. We looked at migrant stocks, we looked at migrant flows, we disaggregated by countries of origin, countries of destination, we disaggregated by skill sets. So what skill sets do the migrants have? And also we mapped it to realities. So what economic activity are they having today? So where do they participate and how do they participate in? And basically where we come out is this number of 250 million migrants worldwide. Mind you, 250 million migrants worldwide. They add disproportionately to the global economy. Disproportionately. I tell you how. And if there's only one fact you take with you from this session to the drinks outside, it's that, the disproportionate positive effect on the global economy migrants have. Migrants are, interestingly enough, pretty steadily for the past half a century or so, about 3.5% of the global population. 3.5, last 50 years. didn't change much. Looks like it changed much because we're more aware with the recent crisis all over the media, but migrants de facto 3.5%, pretty flat out, last 50 years of global population stock. However, migrants contribute 9% to global output. So mind you, 3.5% of people contribute 9% of global GDP. That's quite a contribution. Quite a contribution. So they contributed more than twice as much as they would have contributed if they had stayed back home. This is quite something, I think, to consider and to be aware of. So the question is now, how do they do it, right? So we looked at the different vectors, how do they do it? And we found 4. So when we're starting with the high-skilled migrants, our high-skilled migrants, first of all, they contribute through innovation. So they hold 50% of the patents of new companies launched in the US. They are the chairs or co-chairs of 50% of the largest VC-backed firms, actually funding quite some innovation themselves, so even a multiplier. And they're also about 40% sorry, missing my thought. Now I do need my papers, see. Oh yeah, here. They have co-founded 40% of global Fortune 500 companies. 40% founded by migrants, mind you. This is quite something, high-skilled migrants. But we all know that migrants aren't only high-skilled migrants. They're also medium-skilled migrants and low-skilled migrants. And these also add quite some value. And by fact of numbers, they even tend to add more because they are more. So your mediums to lower-skilled migrant typically is more entrepreneurial than your native citizen, which means they found an enterprise, and they typically employ 1 or 2 people who wouldn't have been employed otherwise before. They also work in sectors where many of the native-borns don't work. So I see Australia down here. I have an Australian example here. 2 out of 3 taxi and transport drivers in Australia are actually migrants. I have an example from Saudi Arabia here. I don't see the Saudis right now, but there's 9 out of 10 construction workers actually are migrants. So how else would you construct many of the roads and buildings you actually need? So this is actually quite something. This is filling gaps in the native labor market you would have otherwise not have been able to fill. And last but not least, and this is a topic as a woman, as a professional woman here on stage, this is very close to my heart. They also free up capacity in developed markets, in particular for women to participate. Because they do work, otherwise women would do stay at home. Take care of the elderly, somebody sick, mind the kids, work in healthcare, in nursing, instead of maybe getting even a higher education and becoming a doctor, because it's more immediate. So for women in particular in developed markets, this is a highly relevant element. This is something really to praise and to cherish. I also have a fact here in terms of adding to the labor force in top destinations. One of my favorite facts. I picked it and added it to my speech last night on the plane, since it's such a shame that the colleagues from the US could not be here with us today anymore. So in the US alone, 17% of the workforce in the US is migrant-driven. Mind you, 17%. And in fact, 37% of the growth in workforce since 2000 is migrant-driven. Imagine, over a third of the growth in workforce population in a country with a rather stable birth rate. This is very important. So you can't get productivity up as much as you drive growth through productive labor forces coming into your country. Very, very important to keep in mind. Migrants alone, mind you, have added $2.5 trillion to the US economy. Going back to facts, I mean, wouldn't that be a nice fact to consider? This is just, it's objectively a good thing. It's just objectively a good thing. So with that, I'll go on to what are the challenges beyond all of that, because that sounds great, right? So 7 trillion to global GDP, freeing up workforce, everybody being very productive. Yes, but right now, this is a pretty unguided process. So it's just, it happens, right? People pack up and go, and governments are intervening to some degree. There's certainly very little cross-governmental cooperation between the countries where people pack up versus where the people want to go to. And just imagine now, in terms of the power of data, what you could do if you knew more and could manage better. right? So you knew more about the skill sets of the migrants who are coming to your country. Some countries know that already better than others. Some countries are more aware of what they actually need. But imagine you knew, like, who's coming, what their skill sets are, what their alternatives are, what they need for successful integration, what they need in terms of language skills, what they need in terms of professional training, so that they can be productive when they arrive as soon as possible at the highest possible level. I give you an example. In Europe alone, if we did match migrants to adequate jobs, I mean adequate by their educational training and their standards, they could, by our calculations, we're bringing out a new report together with our friends from IOM early next year, probably add to the European economy between 5 and 6 billion per year, by just matching more adequately, by knowing better what you have there and what you could do. So you wonder, why is that? If there's so much value at the table and it's so obvious and it's such a good thing, why do we not know more and therefore manage better? Why is that? So you could say this is a technical problem, right? It's about standardization of data and more investment into data and capacity building for data. This is all true. It's all true, certainly. But I do not think this is actually the underlying reason. Data in migration management always gets the short end of the stick, always. Because it's not immediate. So when I can spend as a government or as a intergovernmental body, if I can spend on an immediate thing, so I can spend on housing, on language training, on registration, these are things that are tangible benefits right now for the migrant population and my home population. And therefore, it's always a direct impact and weighing against an indirect impact of what if I knew more and invested in data instead. And therefore, the cry for data is such a sore one, because we've heard it for over 125 years. I've done some reading on the way here. Apparently there was a data conference in Vienna in 1871, where the concluding remarks were about the standardization of the data points on non-nationals in an international cooperation context, which I found very interesting. So I think the reason is that the value of data in managing migration better is actually not clear. It's all about inputs. It's about more data, more data. I think it's about more value from that data. You should be discussing about, hopefully, in the next couple of days. And while I'm aware that no one-size-fits-all approach will actually solve that equation, I think if every country sat down and thought, what is the highest value at stake for me in managing global migration? So whether I'm a country who wants to attract skilled workers, Australia again, such a great example. I read your skilled migrants filling your vacancies going up from 50 to 67% through being very deliberate about your labor market policies, who you would like to attract, from smuggling to lower cost in remittances to earlier language courses and therefore better integration, no matter what country you are and what your needs are, whether you're a sending country or you're a country of transit or whether you're actually a country who's going to be a destination country. When you know better, you can manage better. So by ending this talk, I would like to conclude saying I'm convinced there's lots of value still on the table and at stake, despite all the very good things actually you can objectively already derive from global migration. In order to reap that value now, you need to have facts. And you need to know up front and think about it where you would like to go with those facts. So ask the questions, where's the biggest value for you individually? And then therefore, what do you need to know in order to get there in a timely and in a relevant manner? So adding migration data to household surveys probably every 10 years or doing it in a census every 10 years is better than not knowing anything, but it's certainly not going to be enough for you to manage in a more coherent and effective way through migrations and the value targets you might have from this. So I would like to conclude with an idea, and more of a wild idea maybe. So what if you came out of the GCM and said, we all agree data is important and we're actually going to do something about it? Something very concrete, we propose something. You could even think about it on 3 levels. So one could be a global level. So you as a global community getting together, and I'm deliberately being a bit pointed because I was asked to spark something into the room and bring an outside perspective, and I can because I'm an outsider just invited to speak to you today. So at a global level, what about having a global migration data hub almost, where everything is not structured around inputs, but around value and outputs? So you as a country self-select and say, here are the 50 dimensions, there could be value for me, these are my top 3 dimensions, therefore this is what I would need to know, and therefore I'm going all in on those dimensions. I'm going to know better, and therefore I can manage better. At a global level, there could be an exchange around it, there could be learning sessions, looking at other countries who've done it well, get some inspiration. I think that could be really something very tangible you could think of in your next sessions, next couple of days. Secondly, if I bring it one level down at a regional level, what about regional migration observatories? Like what about an African migration observatory, knowing where people are, where they go to, what skills they have, what their aspirations are, really fostering an exchange, because it's a topic that goes across borders, so it's not that valuable knowing just what's happening in Somalia if you don't know then what's happening 2 countries up. So I think a regional perspective in terms of a migration observatory, not just for Africa, in Asia, I know there's something in Latin America starting, maybe also along migration corridors. That could be something very interesting. So to say like, what's the corridor and how do you link actually the data points from typical countries of origin to countries of destination? What do you need to know in transit countries to manage better? I think that could be super interesting. And last but not least, nobody does it well yet. Nobody. So you need country champions. So in your group, there should be country champions. Maybe there's 5 countries who do want to put up their hand after the meetings we have here and say, we would really like to manage backwards in terms of what's the value for us. We know what that is. We would like to understand how we get there. And therefore, we are going to invest deliberately in relevant and precise and action-oriented data so we can manage for better outcomes. So no champions out there yet. Maybe some takers in the next couple of days discussion. It was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you. You want?
Thank you. Thank you, so for kicking off this session. Is this working?
We can share this.
Is this any better? We'll share it. Thank you. Let me ask a question to you before, I give time to all of you to prepare your non-statements and your very provocative and interesting question to Solveig. Let me ask you first. So the McKinsey report on global migration, I think, has been a very influential report. I've heard it cited, including throughout the process of the Global Compact, a number of times. Tell me a little bit more about your experience of using the data in the report and the facts, particularly when you work with clients that have, in a way, nothing to do with migration. Say you're working with clients in the youth and labour market space. What use do you make of that data? What's your experiences of the data and the facts actually making a difference, inspiring and influencing audiences and people who perhaps up to then did not have very strong views on migration and find out more through your work?
Absolutely. So many of my clients are government clients, and I help them through those facts actually think through some of those issues. Particularly in government, you always, as I said in the beginning, there's political context you're operating in, there's the media, there's your population, it's always a very emotional topic. So with many of our government clients, just a fact base, a comparative fact base is something that was very helpful to many of the discussions, because you can start at a same level, right? You can start with the facts at the table, and therefore what do you need to do? A second component which might be interesting is the private sector. So our private sector clients, the employers in particular, they obviously ask, they think about the future of work and the skill shortages. They look at the same time at the demographic pyramids in many of the geographies and say, is migration one of the levers? If we can't activate the women, how much longer would the elderly need to stay in the labor market so that we can even keep up with our economic growth aspirations if we can't ramp up productivity enough? So migration in this one is also a very core topic to engage actually on the same playing field, if you will, with the same facts as well, the private sector on what's most needed, and actually create an equation where everybody wins. So the private sector on the talent side, the government on the efficient management and better outcomes side, and then the migrants themselves, obviously, because they are also getting the outcomes or better outcomes than they would have otherwise.
Thank you. So then I couldn't agree with you more that issues of value of data and use of data is critical to actually make that real investment that is needed. And too often there is a call for more data for the sake of it, which risks undermining the whole argument. Thank you. So who would like to go first from the audience to ask a question to Solveig? I am going to, I'm going to, great. They're starting to show on my screen. I believe I have a question. Is that, I find it difficult to read it. I think the first question is from Panama. Is that possible? I can't. Or why don't we go, if not, we'll go from Bulgaria, which is the second one on the list. So Bulgaria, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Solveig Hieronymus for bringing up the informal and interactive character of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Bulgaria, this and this next year, is the president of the conference of the states parties to the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. The policy, one of the priorities of my country is to protect the human rights of the most vulnerable migrants. That is to say, children, women, and people with disabilities. I would be grateful if you share with me, with us, what percentage of the people on the move are the most vulnerable groups, children, women, and people with disabilities.
Let me just take, before you answer that question, let me take one more question from Pakistan, and we'll round off 2 or 3, and then we'll hand over back to you, and I'll help you to remind you the question that I asked. But thank you very much, Bulgaria, for sticking to my plea for a short and direct question.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I thank the distinguished panelists for sharing very interesting data. While I'm not an expert in data collection or data analysis, but my understanding is that most of your work is focused on understanding the trends in terms of the impact of migrants and migration on economy and development. Mm-hmm. So have you also thought of or already focused on, let's say, understanding the trends through data collection regarding, let's say, the access of social services in host countries, countries of destination for the migrants, or of better understanding the challenge of the issues like racism, xenophobia, discrimination? Because I believe that when we talk about data, we need to promote data collection in various dimensions so that we can then inform our policies to address the challenge in a more effective manner. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. And given that at the moment I don't have another question, oh no, there is one. There's a question from the Philippines, and I'll come back to you, Solveig, for your answer. Please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the resource person. From amongst data that you have presented to us this afternoon, perhaps the most difficult from among the moving parts of migration, the most difficult part would be measuring the invisible, or trying to be invisible actor in the whole migration process, which happens to be irregular migrants. Do you have a sense of how to measure this actor in the whole process, given the fact that, they can be very fluid, and the willingness to come forward is not there? Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Let me take the last question from the Netherlands, and there will be opportunities for others to come in at the next round.
Let me answer those first 3. Otherwise, I think my memory might escape.
I'm happy to remind you. You've got one on disability.
No, I'm about it until now, but I think we shouldn't pile on at this point. It's 6 p.m. So let me start with the Philippines question and on irregular migrants. I agree with you. I think this is clearly the most, by definition, this is clearly the hardest target group. How we went about it is actually we did not measure, or we did not do our analysis on flows, we did it on stocks. So we did it on stocks when, and that sounds very technical, but this is literally analytical terms in terms of we did not count the migratory movements, if you will, but we looked at migrants when they were in their country of origin and in their country of destination, and we backtracked the time they spend, in particular, for instance, going from one place to the other. But when you analyze migrants once they're in a destination country, it almost doesn't matter whether they're regular or irregular as long as they're there. Because at some point they will participate, and they have different outcomes, so depending on where they go, so they have different access to language courses, to labor market support, to housing support, healthcare support. So there are difference in outcomes, but from understanding the target groups, once they are in some destination countries, there's typically enough touch points at least to identify regular versus non-regular, and then actually to start interacting with that target group. But that's easier once they're there. It's very hard to do when it's a flow perspective, which we didn't take for the sake of the analysis.
Do you want to take the other two?
Second was the vulnerable migrants over there,
and the
right?
trends in social services.
Yeah, from Bulgaria, the vulnerable migrants over there.
Pakistan,
so in terms of global stock of migrants, about 42% are female. So which brings it to 58 male. So it depends where you start defining vulnerability, right? So I personally wouldn't argue that a woman per se is vulnerable. I would argue children are, and I would argue people with diseases and illnesses are. So first question, 42% were women. Then children, also depending a bit how you define the age. If you would define under 18, there was about 20 to 25%. With those ages, people, when you ask them how old they are, depending on the outcome they would like to produce, it's always not as clearly cut, but I would roughly say 20 to 25%. And then obviously there's, across all cohorts, very little elderly migrants where like disease patterns would tend to go up. A couple of infectious diseases, but these are not like long, complex, prevalent diseases you could probably not cure when people arrive. And I think all in all, the benefits are so large that we can, no matter how many really vulnerable cases are in the global migration stock, we can afford to be really generous because the benefits are just towering if we manage them well.
And was one question on disability, and then I'll give Netherlands very quickly the floor.
Now I do need a reminder on the last question. So, yes, and the social media and the social service. Yes. So coming from continental Europe, this is clearly something we look at very carefully in terms of what is the access to the welfare system, how much of a driver is that, how do you even price that in a country where schooling, for instance, is for free, like how do you price the value of access to healthcare, how do you price a safe life and all sorts of other cash and non-cash benefits. So this is clearly a driving factor. Misinformation, so when we're just talking about facts, so alternative facts, misinformation around many of those benefits is also certainly a driving factor. So it's very important to also very clearly explain the facts to migrants before they leave, what the real opportunity is. It might still be very attractive, but yes, that's certainly important. Also the whole social sentiment and communication around it. I think the more we know, and that's back to my point of it's not enough measuring data in a census every 10 years. It's about being much more agile in terms of social listening, engaging on platforms, proactively sending the right information in the right channels the migrants read. I think it's very important to bring also more facts in those channels and make it a more two-way street of communication in order to manage expectations and then potentially steer opinions and then also produce a better outcome for all involved.
Thank you. Can I ask the Netherlands to ask very briefly a question, and then Silva will get back to them, and then we'll move on to the second speaker, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to add to the question that was already asked by the Philippine colleague on the irregular migration. Maybe you can explain a little bit more on the methodology that you use to also see what the added value or the economic value of people who are, by definition, outside of the regular labor market when they are irregular migrants in many of the countries of destination. What your methodology was to identify their added value, and at the same time a question I wanted to ask about, do you make a difference between regular migrants that come for labor purposes or people that come as refugees to countries of destination and their value to the labor market and to the economy.
So I'll answer your second question first. So I'm sure this number has been floating around in many discussions today, but when we look at total migrant stock, 90% are voluntary migrants and about 10% are refugees. So in terms of the global context, the 90% like voluntary, you can now argue if very dire economic conditions in your home country makes you a voluntary migrant. I think that's getting into a bit of a political definition, but the vast majority, 90% of people are more voluntary, economically driven migrants, so these tend to participate more actively and sooner. Refugees, however, when they also come into a country, it takes them longer, because it takes them longer. They need to go to the asylum procedure, depending on where they land. Can take anything from 3 months to 2 years, depending on country of origin. Then also it takes them longer because they're traumatized along the way. It's a much less deliberate move. So by the time they arrive to the labor market, it's later. So time will tell, with in particular the recent refugee crisis in Europe, time will tell if they have the same outcomes as other migrants on the labor market. But once they arrive and they're through the asylum procedure and can participate in the labor market, that would then be actually the same way of looking at them. I would just personally think that will just take longer time. And then on the definition of the value add of irregular migrants, I would love to see you, I see a couple of people getting a bit angsty on the technical definition. I would love to see you outside if you would like, and I'll explain it to you in more detail how we measured it. But in fact, at some point, they participate too. So whether you're a regular or irregular construction worker, at some point you're adding to the economy when you look at the needs in the labor market. So there's a way then whether you add on the tax front, but you still make a living, you don't live on the welfare state. So at some point, we also looked at how they will contribute. As long as you participate and somehow make a living, that's not in an illegal way, but you actually do work and help out at home and do have some form of support, sustaining yourself, you also still contribute, just not on the tax front.
Okay, thank you, Solveig. Thank you, all of you, for kindly sticking to my suggestions to ask pointed and specific questions. Please join me in a round of applause for Solveig, our first ever TED speaker at the UN meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Solveig. Okay, let's move now to a very different topic. In fact, one could argue all the way to the other end of the spectrum of ideas and human experiences. We're now going to talk about human perceptions, what people feel about the phenomenon of migration and what their experiences are. And to discuss that, we have Duarte Geraldino, who is an independent journalist, and together with a team of other journalists, they produce multimedia reports and short films that have been distributed widely all around the world. I think Duarte has experience of traveling his own country, which is the US.
I do.
Reporting on a number of social and economic issues where migration features, and he's also a special correspondent for PBS NewsHour. Not only that, but actually Duarte in 2017 was awarded a residency at the TED Foundation. So I am thrilled to be about to witness a real TED talker at this event. And while at TED Foundation, Duarte created HearOurStoriesNow.org, who's a digital journalism project to organize data and first-person narratives about immigration and its related impact on human capital. So without further ado, Duarte, please, over to you.
Thank you very much. I want to make sure you guys can hear me. So 36 people crammed into a tight area for about 7 days. Within the first hour, people started jockeying for more space. They wanted the real space, but also psychological space, because it was getting stressful. By the end of the first day, the rumors started, mostly directed at the newcomers. Some of the legacy members of the group were looking at them and were complaining, suggesting that they were the cause of the situation for the group at that moment. They mocked them for the way they looked, for the way they sounded, for the way they talked, and blamed them. Now that's just one way you can describe my last family reunion. And so being here at the United Nations, where we're talking about the safe and orderly flow of newcomers around the world and narratives that travel with them, makes me feel quite at home. Now, at my family reunion, we didn't allow these rumors and these narratives to divide us too much because, after all, we are family. We're actually descended from a single woman who had 2 marriages, and that's unique in and of itself to have a family reunion that tracks the matrilineal line because so many are only about the male line. Her name was Ana Clara, and she was the first migrant that I had ever met. I remember looking at her brown hands, how they were disfigured because of time and also her journey to the United States. She lived a unique life, but for many people, she was just invisible. Hidden by her size, she was barely 5 feet tall, hidden by her accent, by her gender, and the thought that she was always about to go home. There was this belief that people had. But she was actually home in the United States, and she ended up dying decades ago, surrounded by a large and growing family of U.S. citizens. And if she had been around during the last family reunion, she would have been the first one to squash those rumors and those narratives because they were causing divisions. But that is where she and I differ. Because I'm an independent journalist who looks at global migration issues through the lens of group dynamics. And I was more interested in learning how the stories that were being told about the newcomers were actually more a reflection of the storyteller, the existing group, than anything else. There are about 250 million people, migrants, living, loving, learning in countries where they were not born. And unfortunately, the popular narratives about them don't highlight how they enrich their new homelands. In fact, quite the opposite is true. Often these narratives are laced with racism, fear, xenophobia. They incite intolerance and enable otherwise compassionate citizens to look the other way when this group of people are being abused or dehumanized. This is our collective problem. So what do we do? How do we get this place? Well, we got here because essentially it's easier to show disgust than it is compassion. And to be frank, our species, humans, we are wired to focus on things that elicit fear, that are strange, remember them and speak about them, while at the same time, our planet, with all its amazing technological connections, is wired to spread stories that appeal to our instincts at lightning speed around the world so that they generate the maximum number of clicks, the most ad revenue. These are problems, but also critically significant that we shouldn't neglect is that the same forces that compel migrants to leave their countries of birth, environmental change, economic shifts, political shifts, terror, war, inequality, all these factors are also bearing down on destination countries. The only difference is degree. So that effectively, citizens see in the face of these newcomers, and this is key, they see their own fears about their own status in their own country. So what do we do? Whenever we talk about migrants, and as we are coming up with this global compact for the safe and orderly flow of newcomers around the world, we must also talk about the citizen, because citizens have the power to disrupt this process. As you all know, there are countries that have pulled out of this process already because they fear that the interests of these global migrants are at odds with their citizenship. That is a problem. But so much of it is based on narratives. So we have to ensure that the stories we tell about these migrants and refugees reflect fact. Because stories, all these stories have the power to shape policies. And they often lurk in the minds of people who create these laws that govern life for migrants and refugees. Now, in my work, I collect these counter-narratives. And I focus on citizens for two reasons. Number one, because they have extraordinary power to influence this process, but also because they are the taxpayers, the voters, the ones most able to speak up without fear of reprisal in a country. And two, because none of us live as individuals. A cornerstone of my research is that we are not just nations of single people, we are nations of relationships, social circles. And these social circles, when they grow, and oftentimes they include migrants, the country itself is stronger. And a lot of the narratives, the first-person narratives that I collect, reflect those strong relationships, those social circles. For example, before I came to Mexico, I was in the Caribbean, and I was driving with a source who was explaining to me the dynamics of hiring on the island. And we came across a checkpoint. And at this checkpoint, I was surprised because it wasn't very late at night, it was an odd day, and she leans over and says, "They're trying to find the undocumented people because there are not enough jobs for our citizens over here, and the government is trying to show people that they're doing something." But it doesn't really work because the migrants know where these checkpoints are. They advertise them in order to tell people that they're doing something. And really it doesn't matter because during the hurricanes that battered our island, we all stuck together because we recognized that we were on this island by ourselves. The documented, the undocumented, the native, the newcomer. She says, we were here together. And that process, that trauma sort of solidified those relationships. Here's another example. Before that, I was on the Atlantic coast of the United States, in one of the most religious states in America. And in that state, I was huddled with a group of activists who were trying to get churches to help people at risk of deportation, to allow these people to stay inside the church so they could buy more time so they can argue their case and potentially stay. Now, to put this into perspective, the United States currently has a policy where, just a policy, not a law, they discourage immigration agents from violating the sanctity of these sensitive locations. So it is an opportunity for activists to keep some migrants in the country if they live in these churches. And they're exploiting this opportunity. Now, for some historical perspective, the sanctuary movement began in the 1980s when civil wars were ravaging Latin America and so many refugees were funneled into the United States seeking political asylum. In that era, churches and synagogues, they aided the flow of these refugees. Many of the people involved in that process were prosecuted and convicted. But even today, you can see some of the children of these refugees. They sound completely normal. They have no hints of ever having any ties to anywhere else. That movement has morphed today because now it's about reshaping a narrative, creating a counter-narrative. These activists in these churches, they're focusing on the message. They're coming out, they're being public, saying, we as a group, and assume that each church represents 100, potentially hundreds of people, are coming together to house this migrant who is at risk of being deported. And that's a powerful statement right there. They have people, sometimes staffed 24 hours a day, waiting, watching to see if an immigration agent comes to the church. Now, I asked one of the pastors, so what happens? Let's say the agents actually come knocking at the door and they're ready. What are you going to do? And he tells me, if that happens, we are going to call our congregation together. We cannot physically stop them because there's no law that prevents these agents from coming into a church. But we can all come to bear witness, to let this story be known, not just that this migrant, this undocumented person was taken away, but more important, more critical, that we as a group were supporting this person. We weren't family, we were friends, we were a church. We were a group. We were recognizing that these newcomers enrich our country, not just as individuals, not just as economic contributors, but enriching our lives on a deeper level, because we are a nation of groups. Now, he ended by saying, what he wanted was to make sure these stories were told, because there is power in these narratives. And that's what I'm doing today. You know, there is power in every story, certainly the ones that are true, but also the ones that are false. And if we don't ensure that they're based in fact, very bad things can happen. Because what we allow to spread today, these narratives, impact our future. Which is why, if Ana Clara had been alive, during that family reunion, she would have been so quick to squash these narratives, these rumors that were forming, causing divisions within my group of 36. But I'm different, because I prefer to look at those narratives that are negative about the newcomers as an indication of deeper problems within a country. Because it's not just the migrant, it's what's happening in the destination country. And a better solution is to tackle the problems in the country and not demonize the newcomers. So as we look at these global compact, we have to look at both sides in order to make sure everyone is on board. And I want to show you a picture of Ana Clara. This is her in a New York City tenement about 70 years ago, roughly. And she's standing on a fire escape. And that little girl with the hat on, that's my mother. And it's befitting that she is on a fire escape because in many ways, she did escape. She escaped a life that would have choked her. And all of us, her more than 100 descendants living in the U.S., and everyone she encountered along the way is richer for it. You see, like so many migrants, Ana Clara's particular situation, her lack of opportunity, proximity to violence, her gender, necessitated, compelled her to move to some place where it was a little bit brighter, where she felt a little bit more comfortable, where she was drawn to, where she felt a little bit more life, even though she lived in that tiny apartment with 6 children. And if you look even a little bit closer, you might also see that she's smiling. I imagine what she knew when this photograph was taken, what she would have wanted all of you to know, what it has taken me countless interviews and so much research to fully understand is that migrants are as much a reflection of their destination as their origin. And for our own good, we must protect them along the way. You are all my family. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you, Duarte, and thank you to Ana Clara, in fact, for being the inspiration of such a beautiful story. So me and you spent a few hours together yesterday and today, and there was an elephant in the room during those 2 days, or rather an elephant not in the room today. So the US is not here today to hear the story. You are an American journalist that travels up and down the country and that reports on the story of American people coming from all corners of the world, having a life, a brighter life in America. What do you think it means that the US is not in the room tonight and may not be part of the next few months of political negotiations for the people that you meet on your journeys?
Well, the reality is that a sizable portion of Americans feel that the flow of migrants and refugees are at odds with the country. I recognize that. But there is also another side to this. And there is a battle in my country. I respect the administration and what they're doing. There are approximately 40+ million foreign-born people in my country. So it's a reality that we really focus on. When I learned that the US had pulled out, I wasn't surprised that my country had done that. But I also know that we are all living on the same planet, and while my country may not be directly contributing to this process, we're watching. And oftentimes, a solution the same solution can be generated by two different sources. And I would be surprised if what the ultimate immigration policy in the United States is very much different than what you will eventually see from the UN.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Duarte. Can I ask now all of you to come forward and ask questions to Duarte? If you don't do so, I've got quite a few in my head that I will go on with. So please come forward with some questions. Okay, let me give you maybe a few minutes to think about it. I'm terribly sorry, I can't see all the way down. Okay, so we have we've had a combination, I'm not quite sure which of the two it is the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights or the UN High, sorry, it's disappeared again. The screen goes on.
Hello?
Let me ask you one question while we try to sort this out. Can I ask you something that really puzzles me, and is something that I'm very aware we all need to work harder on. How much do your stories resonate with people around, with audiences that are, fundamentally, who are opposed to immigration and hold very strong views, very strong anti-immigrant views? What's your experience of your narratives and your stories making a difference in people's, very strongly held existing perceptions on the realities of migration?
So your question speaks to a deeper problem. There are a lot of things that are factual in this world, and both sides of the debate can point to different facts to prove their side. When I structure my stories, I obviously look at the audience, and I try to make sure that they're being distributed through multiple channels. So as an independent journalist, I have this luxury. And in addition to telling stories that clearly have a particular audience in mind, that are more nurturing towards immigrants, I seek out the other side because there is validity in it. It is a very real concern in my country about jobs. We have an extraordinary increase in income inequality, which we see around the world, and there are a lot of Americans who don't know where to turn. So I tell those stories too, and hidden in the background is often this thought that if we just close our borders, then maybe there would be enough jobs. Of course, the reality is that the jobs are leaving. It's not that the immigrants not coming in would increase more jobs.
Thank you. And thank you for helping me with the system. I've got the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights and then IPU after that.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to say that from our perspective, we recognize very much the thoughts that were conveyed to say that migration is often about proxy fears. It's often about fears about globalization or welfare states, terrorism or inequality. And to link the last two talks, in the work that we've done, along with many of the partner agencies in the UN, we recognize the limits, in a sense, of evidence and data, that a rational debate cannot be purely rationalistic in the course of migration, but it must be about emotion, sympathy, and values. And my question really is how then can we foster these emotions, which in a sense must be more about empathy than sympathy or just simple pity or charity. And that one of the things that we would like to highlight is a human rights-based approach to the discussion about narratives, which really built on the fundamental principles of non-discrimination and accountability, it brings the human being, the migrant, into the center of the discussion. But as you said, it brings the community into the discussion as well. It brings the human beings that are part of the community into that discussion. So I wonder how you might reflect a little further as well on a human rights-based approach and bringing people into that discussion. But thank you very much for your talk.
Listening to you, that was one of the things I struggled with for several years, because sadly there is this mentality that for migrants in particular who may be at risk of deportation or who may not have citizenship, that no one cares unless you're a migrant or married to one. And it's very, very painful to hear this when I'm pitching stories or shopping them around. It's one of the things I encounter, which is why I flip the script a little bit and I look at it differently. So I chronicle the lives of citizens or natives who have lost people to deportation. Because again, these are the taxpayers, these are the voters, they're the ones who have some clout. And literally, this has been a way to get more of this out there, to make sure that there are people around that one migrant, around that one victim, around that one vulnerable person, that everyone else can empathize. It is so sad that when something horrible happens to anyone, we create 1,000 reasons why it would never happen to us. Or we suggest that this person could never affect my life. Well, my work seeks to show you that yes, it does. And if we focus on that social circle, then I think you'll have more residents, because those people are here to stay.
Okay, thank you, Duarte, and thank you very much for reminding us all something which I feel very strongly about, having been involved in the process for the compact thus far, that as much as this compact is obviously tasked to come up with a framework for migration policy and action, it really needs to speak with people and with interests and with topics that, you know, that where migration is not the beginning and the end of the challenge, whether it is labor, whether it is global health, whether it is climate change. We really need to find a way to engage with all these realities in the same way as you and a number of other very talented journalists are really showing the way in doing it with their reporting and their narrative. So thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move now to the last speaker of the session, and we're going to talk about something that I feel is often invoked, but actually very rarely then, you know, engaged with, which is the idea, the voice, the experiences of migrants themselves. So we're about to hear from Ola Orekunrin. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. Please join me on the stage. Who is a British-Nigerian medical doctor, helicopter pilot, and healthcare entrepreneur, founder of Flying Doctors Nigeria, which is founded in 2007, which is the West Africa first air ambulance service. It's dedicated to bringing patients with trauma care to the most remote parts of West Africa to healthcare facility. And the inspiration for Ola to create this company and this very important service was the sudden tragic death of her younger sister, who died in Nigeria because she couldn't access fast enough emergency services to take her to a medical facility. The other interesting and very important things about Ola is that Ola, I'm not sure whether you were born in the UK, and did all her school in the UK and graduated and qualified as a medical doctor in the UK, and then looked around and decided that the best option for her life was to move back to Lagos, where her family was originally from, in pursuit of a better life. So I think a very interesting migration story. Ola, over to you for your 15 minutes talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to be briefly talking about shaking up the migration debates. My name is Dr. Ola Brown. I just got married, so Orekunrin Brown. And I run the Flying Doctors Nigeria, which is one of the largest air ambulance services in West Africa. And I started it almost 10 years ago, was said in the introduction, when my younger sister died because we couldn't get her to hospital fast enough. I started thinking about the idea actually when I was in medical school. And even though I hadn't lived in Nigeria as an adult, I saw an opportunity to do some good for some families and try and prevent any other families from having to experience what my family went through. But I also saw a very solid economic opportunity and a business case for starting an air ambulance in Nigeria. So I moved back to Nigeria with a startup capital of about 3,000 pounds. And I've grown that company over the past 10 years to a valuation of about $20 million. So I want to talk about my migration story in that context, moving from London to Lagos, with the view of taking advantage of an economic opportunity that has very large social impact. So I'm going to be talking about 3 ways to shake up the migration debate. So hopefully I'll be giving 3 solid policy suggestions for shaking up the debate around migration. And I'll be doing that on the background of some of the horrific images that we've seen in the past few weeks. I don't know if anybody recognizes that image in the corner. That was when 26 Nigerian women drowned in the Mediterranean Sea. 2 of them were pregnant. And it's such a horrific story of how we lost so many of our very own sisters in Nigeria over just in the period of the past month, I think. So that's the context that I'll be layering this story on. So there's 3 ways that I think that we can shake up the migration debate. Number 1, to disrupt development. Number 2, to start viewing migration as a tool for global economic empowerment. And number 3, to change the narrative around migration to the developed world in the first place. So first of all, I'm going to talk about disrupting development. I'm sure a lot of people in this room had their first smartphone was probably a BlackBerry phone. And I'm sure everybody can remember it very well. It was small and you could check your email for the first time on your phone, and it had these buttons that you could press, and you could type like a miniature typewriter in your palm. And I mean, at the time, Blackberries were working. I mean, Blackberries were the coolest thing ever. People were calling them crackberries because everybody was so addicted to them. But at some point, there was a fundamental disruption, and people started favoring the leaner, sleeker, sexier, more user-friendly Samsung and Apple phones with a single button instead of the typewriter, so the typewriter layout of the BlackBerry. And in the same way that we've seen evolution and disruption in healthcare and technology and telecoms, I don't think we've seen that same level of disruption in development. For the past 60 years, the development industry has been fixated on poverty reduction rather than prosperity creation. And this is a problem because a lot of migrants from Nigeria, like those 26 women, and a lot of the men that take that journey across the Sahara Desert through to Libya and to the Mediterranean to reach Europe, are not leaving poverty. They're seeking prosperity. These journeys cost anything between $2,000 to $5,000, that journey across to Europe. So these are relatively expensive journeys. So in order to help these people and to change the conversation, the development infrastructure must adapt to help people find prosperity. So we need to make development across the UN and the World Bank and all the other development organizations a bit more like the Samsung phone, a bit sleeker, a bit faster, a bit more adaptable, and a bit more user-friendly, something that the customer actually needs and wants. And how do we create this prosperity? It's through investment. This is actually quite a startling ratio. The statistics do change, but these are the latest ones that I have. Africa is home to 15% of the global population, contributes 3% to global GDP, but only receives 0.1% of funding from investors. If we're only receiving 0.1% of investor portfolios, how are we going to grow our way out of poverty and into prosperity? The reason why those 26-year-old girls left Nigeria was because they wanted prosperity, they wanted jobs, they wanted a more decent standard of living that they could have that they wanted to enjoy. And that could have been provided within Nigeria or within West Africa at least, if they had access, if entrepreneurs had access to capital to provide those jobs, to grow those industries. You see, the thing about moving from poverty alleviation to prosperity creation. Poverty alleviation is about handing people things. It's about giving out condoms and providing fresh water and giving out drugs and giving out girls sanitary towels. But people with jobs can buy their own water and provide their own sanitation and buy their own sanitary towels. And I think that that's what Africans really, really want and need. So that's the first point about disrupting development. The second point is about looking at migration differently. This 22 billion is actually the amount that flows into Nigeria through remittances, through the Nigerian diaspora. The budget of Nigeria is 22 billion. So that's a significant amount of money coming from these networks. For other West African countries, it's even more significant. Remittances make up 26% of Liberian GDP and 20% of Gambian GDP. But this doesn't only benefit the sending countries, it also benefits the receiving countries, because migrants have this transnational presence, and migrants and diasporans build communities and links through their territories of origin and destination, through their remittances, through their investment, through their skills, and they link countries together, providing better trade relationships and providing a more balanced global economy. So my second point is really about making sure that we see migration as a positive both for the sending countries and the receiving countries. Now this slide is just to also about removing unnecessary barriers to migration. And one of my major bugbears in my business is transit visas. So in order to fly a patient, let's say we have a British citizen, for example, who is injured in Congo, all of our doctors, about 100 of them, all need British visas in different specialities to fly into England for 10 minutes and then fly back to Nigeria. So we're continually at the embassy having to renew all these visas. And it goes the same for a lot of people that would have had opportunities to attend educational conferences or business conferences. Attending a conference for the average African is probably a 6-month job, because they not only have to apply for visas for the receiving country that the conference is in, but maybe the 2 countries that they would have to pass through as well. So flying from Nigeria, I flew to France and then transited in America before I came here. That's, if I didn't have a British passport, that's 6 months of work, visiting embassies and doing interviews, both at the French embassy for the transit visa. I'm only spending 2 hours in France, and I was spending half an hour in America. But I have to apply for visas to all of these countries, including the country that I'm going to. And this limits both economic opportunities in terms of business and also educational opportunities for many people from developing countries. My third point is around changing the narrative of migration from developing countries to developed countries. Now, this is a picture that most people, the kind of picture that most people would relate to Africa. And this is true to some extent, but it's a single story. And the problem with single stories is not that they're not true. There is an element of truth to this, but a lot of single stories are incomplete. And if they're not challenged, they become stereotypes. And when they become stereotypes, that becomes the only story. And this cannot be the only story, because this is Africa, but this is also Africa. This is my city, Lagos. There are actually 700 companies in Africa with revenues of $500 million. If these stories are not told, and the dominance that the Western media has on this kind of story continues, then that's the only story that young Africans will see. And of course, they'll think their only route to prosperity is moving to a Western country, moving to Europe, or moving to America to find their fortunes. And also, the second problem is this is the only story that investors see. So they're more reluctant to invest in a continent where all they hear about is war and disease, as opposed to a more prosperous economy shown in these pictures. This is quite a shocking quote, I think, from one of the women interviewed for a book called Women and the War on Boko Haram. And this was a lady that was rescued from Boko Haram, one of the girls that disappeared that was rescued, went through a rehabilitation program for 3 months, and then returned to Boko Haram. And when she was asked why she wanted to return to Boko Haram, she said that there were more gifts, better food, more educational opportunities, and better sex. So she went back to the people that she was rescued for economic reasons. So people will always move when they think that there's a better life for them somewhere else. As an air ambulance doctor, I, of all people, and people in our industry will tell you the importance of being at the right place at the right time. And that's what my business is about, getting the right patients to the right medical facility within the right time frame. And our ability to do that makes a difference between life and death, makes a difference between having a limb and losing a limb. And what we're talking about really is being at the right place at the right time. Isn't that the most influential lottery of all? One of the most influential factors on anybody's life is where they're born. And it's almost a lottery. So I'll finish with this Kanye West quote. He opens with the line, and it's from a song, I think his second album. He opens with the line, "Have you ever wondered how it feels to find your dreams?" And he says, "I didn't play the hand I was dealt, I changed my cards. I prayed to the skies, and I changed my stars." And that's what we're really doing here. Everybody in this room is here for a reason, moving towards some kind of goal. You're here pursuing your dreams. And what the Global Compact is really about is helping more people be able to change their cards and pursue their dreams too. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola. And please, someone take a picture and tweet that we did have a quote from Kanye West at the very end of the first day of the preparatory meeting of the Global Compact for migration. That certainly made my day. Ola, quickly, I've apologized in advance to the interpreter. We're keeping you a little bit late. The proceedings were delayed a little bit earlier, but we're going to try to be really quick now and finish in the next 5-10 minutes maximum. And so everybody, maybe easy, it would be really helpful if you can maybe pose your questions in English in case interpreters do need to leave. Ola, I've got lots of questions for you. The first is a curiosity. So we discussed actually before the session today how one of the key misconceptions about migration, particularly migration from Africa to Europe, is that it is those who are educated and those who do have the economic means who make the decisions to move. I'm sure that you get a lot of questions from young, talented Nigerians, possibly young, talented Nigerian women who wonder what to do, having the education and the money to make that choice. What advice do you give them?
My advice really depends on, I think that a lot of people go into decisions without thinking about their end game. So it really depends on what the end game is. I think that Nigeria, like most emerging markets, like Mexico, like Brazil, is a high-risk, high-return environment. So when I left England, my salary was £20,000. So, I've become significantly wealthier by migration. So what I tell young women is to think about the kind of life that they want to lead, what they want to have, and the kind of risks that they're willing to take to achieve that life. And obviously the significant disadvantages of living in Nigeria. I have to generate my own power, I pump my own water, I buy my own security. I mean, the social amenities definitely that are available in the West aren't available in Nigeria, but I think that there's good opportunity, there are good economic opportunities, but if entrepreneurs are willing to take the risk, but we definitely need to have more capital investment and more global investors focusing on the continent.
And on that, were you able to attract investors in your company to help you to get to the 20 million valuation?
Yes, but it was a lot harder. I think that if I was in the UK and I was making even just $1 million a year, I'd attract a lot of investors. But in Nigeria, you really need to make a lot more money than that before you can get those global investors interested, because they have a high risk perception of Africa compared to the West, and that really needs to change. 0.1% of global investment portfolios is not what we need to grow the economy. And even when we do attract money, it's usually hot money. It's hot money, and hot money is the way, hot money burns you. It's kind of money that flows into your stock market and then suddenly they pull out at the as soon as there's a tiny glitch. It's not the kind of money that is patient capital, that stays, that grows with the company, that grows with the countries, etc. It's extractive money. So that's another problem. When people do get investment, or where countries do get investments in Africa, it's a high percentage of hot money.
Thank you very much. I've got time for 2 interventions from the floor. I've got WHO first and then Paraguay.
What I heard is a story which is very moving and very interesting. What I also heard is that your sister, from the beginning of the story, your sister had died because she had no access to emergency health services. This is something that we see in migrant populations, that many of them face the challenge that they have no access or with little access to health services and determinant of health, including decent work, decent travel, or working or living conditions. And this problem even more acute in women and in children and in girls, for example. Now, what we have found is that these dates or this lack of access to health services is not only the issue of the violation of human rights, but it's also, if you look at cost benefits of accessing to health services, what we found from the studies is that if we provide services to irregular migrants, for example, beyond emergency health services, we could country actually save the cost, the long-term cost of providing services to migrants. For example, if we provide services for pregnant, prenatal services for irregular migrant women, we could save the money, for example, in Germany, 48%, in Sweden, 69%, over the period of 2 years, if you provide them beyond the emergency services. So these are both in terms of human right-based issue, as well as in terms of cost benefit.
Thank you.
My question to you is that in the GCM, health is not in there. How do we promote? What do you think how we could promote health in the GCM discussion?
Thank you very much.
Thank
so
you.
I need to stop you there. I've got Paraguay. Disappeared from my list. Okay, I'm not sure this is working, so I actually do have another question for the Philippines. So in case, for whatever reason, Paraguay cannot put the questions, can I ask the Philippines to please go ahead?
Thank you. You mentioned a while ago that the road to prosperity creation is not as popular as poverty reduction, primarily because I think that the road to prosperity creation entails capital and access to loans. What is your sense on this regard, ma'am?
Okay, so you got a couple of questions.
In the context of the GCM.
health in the GCM and attracting capital.
So the first question was about health. And one of the unfortunate things about healthcare is a lot of, in the tech industry is kind of driven by driving the prices of things down. So for example, to take a picture, you would have needed a separate camera, and then you had your landline, then you had a torch, then you had an app to do, you had another device to do certain things, and now all of those things have been combined within your phone. So tech reduces costs, but healthcare costs continually increase, and they increase year on year. So in terms of healthcare for migrants, I agree it should be a healthcare is a fundamental human right for everybody, and it should be part of sort of any migration policy to look after the health, especially emergency healthcare needs of migrants. But at the same time, there's a huge, huge cost burden for healthcare. And I think that one of the things that even the most developed countries struggle with is this huge cost of healthcare. So we need to balance that. And I think that one of the things that we can do, like I was saying, or one of the things that we should be concentrating on was about my first point, really, about trying to create opportunities for people within their home countries. And I think that this would balance, I mean, the reason why people find it very difficult to access healthcare is because healthcare is very, very expensive. So I think that creating opportunities for people in their home countries is a good thing. And the way to create this is obviously through loans, through additional capital being given to these countries and being able to attract this capital, and changing the narrative around a lot of developing countries, a lot of countries that there are high migration flows, especially economic migration flows, changing the narrative around those stories so they're able to attract investment and grow and employ people. Aliko Dangote is the richest man in Nigeria, and he employs 36,000 people. So he employs basically the population of Monaco. Imagine if we had 100 of them. Then nobody would believe in Nigeria in the first place, and we wouldn't have these tragedies.
Okay, thank you very much, Ola, for sharing your stories, your experience, and leaving us, I think, with certainly statistics that certainly remain with me for some time, from £20,000 in London to 20 million in Lagos. How about that for a different way of thinking about migration in a truly global and interdependent world? So thank you very much. And with that, please join me in a round of applause for Ola. This is also my opportunities to, first of all, thank you all for staying with us until now, and particularly for making an effort to hear and listen my voice at such a low level. Thank you very much to the co-facilitators and their offices, their staff, for having the vision for this unusual, different and inspiring sessions today, as well as the office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Louise Arbour. Thank you very much for the three speakers who helped us getting ideas and human experiences off the ground, and I very much look forward to see some of these ideas and stories weaved in the Global Compact as it develops. Thank you all. And let me finish with the logistical message, and I need to get to my phone, but now I feel completely empowered to do it because we all need to be a bit slicker and a bit younger in the way we do this, but I've got the details on here. So just a logistical note, we have the pleasure to be invited right now, I think, to a social event, a social evening hosted by the state of Jalisco, but that means that the side event on the progress of the Migrants in Countries of Crisis initiative and how that could inform the Global Compact is shifted from tonight to tomorrow night at 6:30 at the Westin. So same place, same time, tomorrow night, not tonight. Please enjoy your social evening, and thanks again for this very interesting session. Thank you.
you.